The Sega Saturn was a console that struggled from the start against the PlayStation. Hell, even before it had even come out, it was crippled by R&D decisions based on incorrect assumptions on what the market was going to be like. So by the time that some of its final games were coming out, like the game we're looking at today, Burning Rangers, the system was struggling mightily. And in a lot of ways, it shows. But in other ways, Sonic Team was able to get some really great stuff out of the system, even in its waning years. The game is ostensibly about fighting fires, though you do it with lasers. Every time you hit a fire with a laser, crystals pop out of the fire and you have to jump around and run around in order to pick them all up. These crystals power your shield, therefore preventing you from having to burn a life if you get hit by an explosion, as long as you have at least one crystal left. Did I mention this game was made by Sonic Team? Does it show? However, even by the end of the game's first level, it's pretty immediately clear this game will still have boss fights that require you to use those lasers in a more direct way, in order to hurt things instead of just putting out fires. And over the subsequent levels, the game adds more and more incidental robot enemies you have to shoot in addition to the fires. Taking care of those robots as well as the fires themselves can be annoying, to say the least. There's no real lock-on, and it can be extremely difficult to figure out what you're going to hit when you shoot, which makes enemies and fires that shoot back at you incredibly frustrating to take care of in a manner that doesn't result in you losing your crystals. And that's not even taking into account the fact that you're going to still be struggling with the camera as well the entire time you're doing anything else, since it requires manual rotation using the trigger buttons on the 3D controller. And yeah, this game is one of the very few that has full support for the Saturn's analog pad, down to the graphics they show you during the tutorial pointing out the buttons on the controller. And having full analog movement here is, in fact, greatly appreciated, though it can occasionally make the dodge, mapped to backwards on either the D-pad or the analog stick, feel a little weirder than it should. The controls also exacerbate other issues that exist throughout. The boss fights in particular often have so many issues with lag and incredibly low frame rates that they're really just an exercise in shooting and hoping you're doing something, while simultaneously fighting the rendering speed and the controls. It's clear what the strategy for each boss should be, but everything is so sluggish that it's incredibly difficult to pull off as intended. Still, you'll generally get through if you've accumulated plenty of extra continues by saving people throughout the level. None of the boss fights are particularly difficult, it just takes a few tries to figure out how you're going to deal with all the added latency. As such, finding and saving people is definitely your primary goal here, even when the lady on the radio is yelling in your ear that you're going the wrong way. You're generally better off looking in every nook and cranny for people to rescue so you can get bonus lives, even though the percentage ticking up in the upper right-hand corner does mean that taking your time might result in dealing with a whole lot more fire and explosions than otherwise, though it rarely becomes unmanageable. Reinforcing all these decidedly iffy gameplay mechanics, however, is a really fantastic anime aesthetic that's matched by appropriate voice acting, interstitial cutscenes, and over-the-top characters. The core conceit of this game is basically that in the far-flung future, the only remaining deadly threat to humanity is fire, and as such, you play as a member of the group of firefighters dedicated to going around in their spaceship and taking care of all those fires. It's certainly all a bit silly, very much of the time, and occasionally cringeworthy in the ways that a lot of this stuff can be. But it matches the vibe of the game well and has a really great overall feel to it. One of the characters is much more important than the rest in terms of the moment-to-moment gameplay, however, As you run through the corridors, she'll regularly reach out to you in order to tell you to keep going the way you're going, turn right through a door, that sort of thing. But you can also hit a button at any time to reach out to her, and she'll give you dynamic directions on where to go next. It's a really fantastic mechanic that works incredibly well, despite the very obvious stitching together of voice lines occasionally. It's also one that matches the rescue vibe of the game. Someone sitting back at home base with a map open that can guide you through the place you're in. That all makes it a real shame that they gradually abandon the concept over the game's very short runtime, with it becoming less and less useful as the hours go on, until they basically yank it entirely for the final level, where you're left on your own with just a few statically placed callouts instead of the dynamic system. As the radio navigation mechanic sputters to the end credits, the game ends extremely abruptly with an incredibly anticlimactic and easy boss fight that follows up an extremely frustrating platforming section, which leads into a cutscene, then a space shooting section, a brief interlude, and finally a two-phase boss, all of which is a single level that share lives. It feels like the game is just trying to cram every last idea it has into a single level without giving you any breaks, and it's absolutely exhausting. In fact, every single level in Burning Rangers felt worse than the last to me. I was absolutely having the most fun early on in the first two levels in particular. I was feeling far more positive about the game. But by the end, I had soured on it pretty hard, and it made me almost forget some of the better times. This is a game that may appear at first blush to be difficult to recommend. It's glitchy, hard to control, incredibly short. For people looking forward to Sonic Team's big new game in the final days of the Saturn, Burning Rangers could have been incredibly disappointing. At the same time, though, it's a game that shines incredibly brightly despite all of its many faults. And for Saturn owners, certainly managed to act as a light in the darkness, and I do get that. I think it's more of a very fun look at a alternate history where the Saturn got a lot more love in terms of ambitious and interesting games, and I think it's worth an easy second look to check out some of its novel ideas.